The iron gate moaned open as if groaning under the weight of centuries, its rusted teeth scraping stone while candlelight flickered against damp walls. Within those halls, screams once echoed. Women dragged from homes bound in chains, accused of dancing with demons or whispering with the devil. Yet most were guilty of nothing more than being different widows, healers, midwives. In these cursed rooms, their voices were broken until they confessed to crimes no mortal could commit. Tonight we step into the nightmare of the witch trials where torture became truth and silence became death. If you dare to confront this dark history, hit subscribe now, because what you are about to hear will haunt you. The age of witch hunts was born from fear. In the late 15th century, Europe shuddered under famine, plague, and war. Crops failed, children died, storms destroyed villages. Someone had to be blamed. And so suspicion fell upon the vulnerable, those who lived at the edge of society, women whose knowledge of herbs seemed uncanny, or simply those whose neighbors envied them. The church, eager to maintain control, lent its voice to paranoia. What began as whispers of superstition soon hardened into law, and with law came terror. At first, accusations were enough to destroy lives. A neighbor claimed a woman had cursed her cow, a child insisted he saw a figure flying past the window, or a priest declared he had found the devil's mark on someone's skin. But these were only sparks. The fire grew when torture entered the chambers of justice. The theory was simple. Twisted though it was, no innocent soul could resist pain, so if a woman endured torture, she must be guilty. If she confessed under agony, it was proof of her pact with the devil. Either way, truth was carved from flesh, not facts. The first interrogations were crude yet devastating. Women were strapped to racks, their joints pulled until they screamed confessions to crimes they had never dreamed of. Others were forced to endure the swimming test bound and thrown into icy rivers. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, but drowned all the same. The smell of burning pitch torches mixed with the stench of fear. Witnesses recalled the sound of fingernails scraping stone as women begged heaven for mercy. But mercy never came. A testimony survives from a miller's daughter in Würzburg. She described being kept awake for days, light searing her eyes, her body beaten each time her head drooped. At last, delirium overcame her, and she confessed to feasting with demons, to flying on broomsticks, to poisoning crops with curses, fantasies fed to her by her interrogators. She later whispered to another prisoner, "I confessed 2 lies so that I might sleep." But sleep never came. She was hanged before dawn. The torture chambers were not hidden in shadows. They stood at the heart of towns near churches and squares, reminders that authority demanded obedience. Tools hung from walls like instruments in a surgeon's theater, thumbscrews, iron chairs, heated over flames, boots that crushed bones until marrow bled. The air smelled of sweat, blood, and burning oil. To the inquisitors, each scream was a step closer to truth. To the victims, each scream was the sound of their humanity shattering. Priests stood by urging confession as salvation. They told the accused that the soul could only be saved through truth that resist. Communities turned against themselves. A mother might accuse her daughter to save her own life. A husband might denounce his wife when pressed by threats of torture. Children terrified by the spectacle pointed trembling fingers at neighbors they barely understood. Fear devoured loyalty. Trust decayed. In some villages, more than half the women were accused, chained, and dragged into dungeons that reeked of despair. The escalation was inevitable. Once one confession was extracted under torment, it bred others. Women were forced to name accomplices, often whispering names through lips split with blood. Those names became the next victims. A single accusation could ripple outward like a plague, consuming dozens, even hundreds. In Bamberg alone, over 600 were executed in a frenzy of witch-hunting madness. The forest outside the city became choked with gallows, the ground littered with ash. One chronicler, horrified by what he witnessed, wrote, The screams of the tortured reached heaven, but heaven did not answer. The judges demanded truth, but the truth they found was only what agony whispered. His words survive as a reminder that the witch hunts were not the work of monsters from legend, but of ordinary men who believed pain could forge truth and that breaking bodies could save souls. Yet this was only the beginning of the nightmare that would stretch for centuries. As the years passed, the machinery of torture grew more refined, more insidious. Interrogators believed that the body held secrets like a locked chest, and pain was the key to pry it open. They devised instruments that would not kill quickly, but prolong suffering, spiked collars that drew blood with every movement, iron masks that silenced screams, chairs studded with nails heated until flesh fused to metal. Each device was not only a weapon, but a spectacle meant to terrify the community into obedience. In some towns, trials became theater. Crowds gathered outside chambers to hear the muffled cries, to glimpse the accused dragged into court with swollen wrists and bruised faces. Merchants sold bread and wine to onlookers as if executions were festivals. Mothers clutched their children, whispering warnings. "Do not be strange, do not be different, or you will burn." Thus, fear seeped into every home, reshaping behavior until silence became survival. One infamous case in Trier tells of a widow named Greta accused after a neighbor's child fell ill. Dragged into the dungeon, she was bound to the rack. For hours, her body stretched until her screams turned hoarse. At last, she named 3 other women, hoping to end her torment. All 3 were arrested by nightfall, their fates sealed by a confession carved out of pain. Greta herself was executed, her body burned in the square, her ashes scattered to prevent burial. The paradox of these trials was cruelly simple: innocence could never be proven. If a woman resisted, she was branded as hardened by the devil. If she confessed, she confirmed her guilt. Even death did not cleanse her name, for families were left disgraced, their property seized, their lineage marked by shame. In this way, the witch hunts were not merely executions, but tools of control spreading obedience through terror. Yet cracks began to form in the edifice of hysteria. Some judges, once zealous, started to doubt. They noticed the patterns. Every confession sounded the same. Every story bore the fingerprints of interrogators' suggestions. In Bamberg, a chancellor secretly recorded that women confessed to flying to Sabbaths held in places they had never visited, to feasting with demons they had never seen. He whispered to colleagues, "We do not seek truth, we create it." Survivors of torture were rare, but their words cut deep. One woman, spared after naming others, spoke in hushed tones. "I felt the devil's hand only when they bound me. His name was carved into my mouth by their iron, not my will." Her testimony spread in secret, carried by those who dared to question. It planted seeds of doubt in the minds of villagers, though few were brave enough to speak aloud. Priests, too, began to fracture. Some continued to bless the chambers, insisting pain purified souls. Others, horrified, condemned the practices as blasphemy. In one parish, a young cleric confronted his superior, declaring that God would not demand broken bodies for faith. He was silenced, nearly accused himself, but his words lingered in whispers. "If salvation is built on screams, perhaps we worship not God, but fear." Meanwhile, the methods grew only darker. Interrogators introduced the witch's bridle, a spiked mask that pierced the tongue and cheeks, ensuring no silence was possible, only muffled moans. Others forced victims into iron cages suspended over fire, the heat blistering their skin until confessions poured forth like blood. The smell of burned flesh seeped into the stones of the chambers, a stench no prayer could cleanse. Communities began to crumble under the weight of suspicion. Families tore themselves apart. Brothers accused sisters, husbands denounced wives. Property confiscated from the condemned filled the coffers of judges and nobles, creating perverse incentives to keep the frenzy alive. It was not only superstition, but greed that fueled the pyres. And as each fire consumed another life, the smoke carried both fear and profit into the sky. Still, even in the darkest hour, small rebellions sparked. Some villagers hid accused women in barns or smuggled them through forests under cover of night. Others recorded secret testimonies, preserving voices that would otherwise be erased. These acts of defiance, though few, remind us that even amid hysteria, there were those who recognized the cruelty for what it was, a nightmare born not of witches, but of men with iron in their hands and fear in their hearts. The investigator sent by the crown arrived under a veil of storm clouds, his boots sinking into mud as villagers whispered from doorways. He had heard of entire towns consumed by trials of pyres that never ceased to burn. His task was simple on paper: confirm the legitimacy of the witch hunts. But as he entered the dungeon and smelled the iron, the sweat, the charred remnants of bodies, he knew he had stepped into something far darker than justice. Led through the corridors, he saw women shackled to walls, their eyes hollow, their lips split from forced confessions. Some whispered prayers, others stared blankly, their souls already broken. The guards boasted of their efficiency, showing him instruments like prized possessions, thumb screws polished with use-iron boots still stained with dried blood. The investigator said nothing, but each sight carved deeper into his resolve to uncover the truth. At night, he examined the court records. Confessions written in identical phrases, accusations that repeated like echoes. Dozens of women swore to flying through the same storm, dining with the same demons, cursing the same fields. It was too uniform, too rehearsed. He realized these were not testimonies, but scripts lines fed under agony until the victims repeated them like broken dolls. The next morning, he attended a trial. A woman was dragged before the judges, her body so frail she could barely stand. Her crime, a neighbor's child, had fallen ill. Under questioning, she denied everything, swearing by the cross she had never cursed a soul. But when the torturer stepped forward with iron pincers, her resolve crumbled. Within minutes, she confessed to cavorting with the devil, naming names with a trembling voice. The judges nodded solemnly, satisfied that truth had been found. The investigator clenched his fists. He began to speak quietly with townsfolk, gathering stories whispered behind closed doors. A farmer told him his wife had confessed only after days, without sleep, light burning in her eyes until she hallucinated demons. A child admitted he had accused a neighbor because a priest promised him bread. Each account revealed the same pattern: truth bent by hunger, exhaustion, and terror. No justice, only survival. The steward of the court, a gaunt man with ink-stained fingers, carried his own guilt. One night he approached the investigator, clutching a hidden bundle of notes. "I can't keep it anymore," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Inside were records. He had secretly copied lists of women, their confessions, their final words before execution. In the margins, he had scribbled his own doubts. "These words are not theirs. They are ours, forced into their mouths." Together they uncovered more evidence. A secret journal kept by a young clerk described the methods used, keeping women awake until delirium, pressing burning irons into their skin, suspending them by their wrists until shoulders tore. Each torment followed by the same demand: confess. The investigator read with horror, realizing the courts had perfected a machine not for truth but for manufacturing guilt. He confronted one of the senior judges, asking how so many confessions could mirror each other so perfectly. The judge smirked. "The devil's work leaves the same mark," he replied. But the investigator noticed the man's rings, gold heavy on his fingers, wealth drawn from confiscated property of the condemned. He understood then that greed walked hand in hand with fear, feeding the fires as much as superstition. Meanwhile, unrest grew in the town. Villagers, once eager for executions, now whispered of doubt. They had buried too many daughters, too many mothers, too many wives. The air hung heavy with ash, and even children began to ask questions. If they are witches, why do their ghosts weep at night? Rumors spread of strange lights over the graveyard, of voices crying from beneath the earth. Fear shifted from witches to the trials themselves. The investigator knew time was short. He prepared his findings, gathering testimonies, secret ledgers, and hidden journals. But before he could act, another woman was seized, a healer known for her herbs, accused of bewitching cattle. Her screams echoed through the dungeon as he watched, powerless. The judges prepared another pyre, and he realized the final confrontation was no longer about exposing corruption alone. It was about stopping the next fire before the town burned its last innocent alive. The square filled with villagers as the healer was dragged forward, her wrists bound with rope that cut into skin already bruised from interrogation. Mothers held their children close, some averting their eyes, others staring with a mix of fear and fury. The pyre had been built high logs, stacked in cruel order, the smell of pitch heavy in the air. For many, this was not justice, it was repetition, a cycle that had consumed too many of their own. The investigator stepped into the crowd, his cloak heavy with rain, his voice rising above the murmurs. He shouted that the evidence was false, that the confessions had been forged in fire and iron. His words rippled through the square like thunder, silencing whispers. For the first time, doubt stood openly in the marketplace. But the judges scowled, declaring him a deceiver, a man blinded by sympathy for the devil's servants. When the torch was lifted to the pyre, a cry erupted not from the accused but from the villagers. A father whose daughter had burned weeks before hurled himself at the guards. Others followed, wielding farm tools and stones. Chaos tore through the square as the crowd surged, tearing down the structure meant for execution. The healer collapsed to the ground, coughing through tears, alive but broken. The judges fled behind soldiers, their authority cracking under the weight of resistance. The investigator seized the moment, brandishing the steward's secret ledgers before the crowd. He shouted that these were the real records, proof that guilt had been bought with screams, not evidence. Villagers pressed forward, eyes wide, as they read the names scrawled across the pages, their sisters, their mothers, their neighbors. Each mark on the paper was a wound reopened. As torches flickered, the truth spread like fire, but without flame. People who had once stood silent now roared with rage, realizing their grief had been manufactured by those who profited from their loss. A priest stepped forward, clutching his cross with trembling hands, and confessed that he too had doubted, that he had prayed over ashes, knowing they belonged to innocence. His admission struck the crowd like lightning. The silence had broken. That night, soldiers loyal to the crown stormed the dungeon. They tore open doors, discovering cells filled with women, gaunt and hollow-eyed, chained to walls slick with damp. Some were too weak to walk, collapsing as sunlight touched their faces for the first time in months. Others wept without sound, their voices long since stolen by screams. The investigator wrote, "Hell was not beneath the earth. I saw it in those chambers." In the darkest chamber of all, they found the instruments themselves. Racks stained with blood, spiked chairs, bridles of iron crusted with rust and tears. One soldier crossed himself repeatedly, whispering that no demon could have invented cruelties like these, only men. Another vomited where he stood, the stench of rot and iron too heavy to bear. The dungeon became a gallery of humanity's capacity for horror. The judges were dragged before the people, their black robes torn, their faces pale, as the villagers screamed accusations of their own. Mothers wailed the names of lost daughters, hurling curses with voices that shook the walls of the square. For once, it was the judges who trembled, their power stripped bare, their wealth unable to shield them from the fury of a town that had seen too much fire. A trial was convened, but it was not the spectacle the witch hunts had been. Instead of coerced confessions, evidence of greed and cruelty filled the chamber. The steward testified with shaking hands, presenting the ledgers he had copied in secret. Survivors spoke of torture so relentless they begged for death, and the investigator stood firm, declaring that truth must never again be wrung from pain but sought in evidence and reason. The verdict was damning. The judges and torturers were sentenced to prison and, in some cases, execution. Their instruments of cruelty were burned in the square where so many innocents had perished, the flames crackling like a cleansing fire. As smoke drifted into the sky, villagers wept not with grief but with release, though the scars of their losses would never fade. For the first time in years, the square echoed not with screams, but with silence, heavy and reverent. Though the fires of punishment cooled, the memory of the witch trials lingered like smoke that clings to stone. Villagers avoided speaking of the years when neighbors turned upon neighbors, when mothers betrayed daughters, when silence bought survival. Yet the scars remained visible in abandoned homes, in the absence of once lively voices, in the hollow places left at family tables. The horror was over, but it had already reshaped the soul of the community. The investigator documented everything in meticulous detail. His journals described not only the cruelty of the trials, but also the human cost. Entire lineages wiped out children, left orphaned families stripped of land and dignity. His words were not meant to shock, but to warn. When fear rules law, the innocent will burn. Centuries later, these writings would become vital evidence of how hysteria can twist justice into atrocity. The priest who had once blessed the chambers devoted the rest of his life to repentance. He built a small chapel on the edge of the forest where he inscribed the names of the women he could remember into wooden planks, setting them into the walls like holy relics. Villagers visited to weep, to pray, to whisper apologies into the silence. The chapel became a sanctuary not of power but of remembrance. Children grew up hearing two versions of the past, one whispered in shame, another told as warning. Parents cautioned them never to speak hastily, never to accuse in anger, never to confuse difference with danger. Words, they said, are sparks, and sparks can build pyres. Though superstition lingered, a seed of skepticism began to grow, slowly dismantling the fear that had once consumed entire towns. Elsewhere, reform spread. Rulers, alarmed by the chaos, issued decrees limiting the use of torture, demanding higher standards of evidence. Some declared witchcraft no longer a crime, though whispers persisted in villages for decades more. The age of fire faded, but its embers smoldered, waiting to ignite in other places, other times, under different names. Humanity had not ended its hunger for scapegoats, it had only changed their masks. Artists and poets seized upon the tragedy, weaving stories that transformed victims into symbols. Paintings depicted pale women bound in chains, their faces radiant with defiance, even in agony. Poems cried out against the cruelty of man, disguised as piety lines etched with grief and rage. They called them witches, but I call them sisters, burned not by hellfire, but by men. Through art, the silenced found voices again. The ruins of torture chambers became haunted places. Travelers claimed to hear whispers in the stones, the echo of iron boots and muffled cries. Some said the ground near the old gallows grew barren, refusing to yield crops, as if the earth itself recoiled from what it had witnessed. Others swore they saw pale figures in the mist, women with hollow eyes walking the fields they never returned from. Folklore carried the memory long after ink had faded. Historians would later debate the true number of victims, tens of thousands, perhaps more. But numbers alone could not measure the weight of suffering, the terror of a world where confession was born not from truth, but from pain. They argued whether the hunts were driven more by fear, religion, politics, or greed. Yet all agreed on one thing: the victims were not witches. They were women caught in a storm of fear sharpened into law. Modern readers look back with horror, yet unease lingers. For while the instruments of iron and fire have been cast aside, the instincts that fueled the trials remain: fear of the unknown, the hunger for someone to blame, the silence of communities that know better but do nothing. The witch hunts are not just relics, they are warnings etched in blood across history's pages. And so the story does not end with the last pyre extinguished. It continues in every question we ask of ourselves today. Who do we scapegoat when we are afraid? Whose voices do we silence when they make us uncomfortable? And what truths do we torture into existence when the real answers are too painful to face? The witch hunts remind us that horror is not only in the past, it waits in the cracks of the present, ready to rise again if we let fear reign unchecked. In the decades after the last pyre was quenched, villagers tried to rebuild their lives. yet the ghost of suspicion never fully left. Families who had lost women to the trials often avoided speaking their names aloud, fearing that even remembrance might reignite accusations. Silence, once a tool of survival, became a second form of erasure, leaving descendants with gaps in their lineage where grandmothers and aunts should have stood. The investigators' reports traveled far beyond the valley. In royal courts and universities, they circulated like forbidden scripture, shocking readers who had never seen the machinery of torture described so vividly. His words detailing racks, iron boots, and masks were copied into clandestine pamphlets that questioned whether justice could ever be born from torment. These writings sparked the first fragile waves of reform, though not nearly fast enough to heal the scars already carved into countless families. As generations passed, the story of the witch hunts shifted into folklore. Children whispered of women who walked the forests at night, their burned bodies cloaked in smoke, their voices echoing in the wind. Some swore these spirits cursed the descendants of judges and torturers, their misfortunes seen as divine retribution. Whether believed or not, these tales ensured that the memory of the victims remained embedded in the land itself. A few bold chroniclers dared to record the names of the condemned, defying the silence imposed by fear. They created lists in the margins of prayer books, inscribing identities that officials had tried to erase. Centuries later, historians would stumble upon these notes, faint but legible, restoring fragments of humanity to those who had been reduced to ashes. Each rediscovered name was like a candle lit against the darkness. Yet even as memory flickered, the shadow of the witch hunts shaped society. Women who sought independence, who practiced healing, who spoke too boldly, continued to be eyed with suspicion. Though the pyres no longer burned, prejudice smoldered in quieter ways, ostracism, rumors, and control. The ideology of the hunts had not been destroyed. It had only changed form, haunting the structures of power like an invisible ghost. Artists of the Enlightenment began to paint the witch trials not as divine justice, but as grotesque tragedy. Canvases showed women stretched on racks, judges looming like vultures, priests clutching crosses that dripped with irony. Viewers recoiled, recognizing cruelty, masquerading as faith. These works transformed the story from local horror into universal warning, a message that cruelty thrives when cloaked in righteousness. In one chilling account, a visitor to the old dungeon described touching the stones and feeling them warm as if the screams of centuries past had soaked into the walls. He claimed the air itself was heavy, as though the building remembered. Whether true or not, his words reveal how places of torture never truly shed their histories. They breathe them silently into those who enter. By the 19th century, intellectuals began openly condemning the witch hunts as mass hysteria. They studied the ledgers, the confessions, the absurd testimonies of flying feasting and shape-shifting. Scholars concluded what survivors had always known: these were not truths, but inventions carved out by fear and greed. Yet even in exposing the madness, many admitted that the sheer scale of the tragedy remained almost impossible to comprehend. Villagers who still lived near the ruins passed down quieter forms of remembrance. On stormy nights, mothers would light candles in windows, whispering prayers for the nameless ones. Children were told to leave offerings of bread or flowers at the forest's edge, a gesture to appease wandering souls. These customs blurred the line between superstition and mourning, proving that grief often survives longer than reason. Today, historians count tens of thousands dead, yet the true number will never be known. What can be known is this: the women who perished were not witches. They were human beings trapped in an age where confession was forged in agony and silence was mistaken for guilt. Their legacy endures as a mirror, forcing us to ask whether we too might still allow fear to twist justice into cruelty. In modern times, the ruins of old courtrooms and dungeons have been transformed into museums. Visitors walk through narrow corridors where chains once rattled, staring at instruments displayed behind glass. Guides describe their use with solemn voices, and tourists shiver, imagining the screams that once filled the space. The air still feels heavy, as if the stones themselves remember the weight of centuries of anguish. Scholars emphasize that the witch hunts were not only fueled by superstition but also by politics and greed. Nobles seized land from executed families, courts profited from trials, and churches wielded fear to tighten their grip on communities. The victims were not merely casualties of ignorance, they were sacrifices to power, their suffering converted into wealth and authority. This truth makes the horror even sharper, for it shows that cruelty was not an accident but a design. The journals of the investigator preserved in archives remain among the most haunting documents of the era. In one entry he wrote, "I thought I came to uncover witches. Instead, I found only broken daughters and widows confessing lies with tongues torn by iron. If there are demons, they were the men who held the keys." His words, raw and unflinching, carry the weight of testimony that no fire could erase. Folklore still thrives in villages once scarred by trials. Locals tell of ghostly figures wandering the fields, their faces half-burned, their hands bound. Travelers swear they have heard sobbing carried on the wind or bells tolling when no church is near. These stories, though born of fear, keep memory alive. They ensure that the victims, stripped of dignity and life, remain present in legend. In literature and film, the witch hunts are often dramatized with flames and shadows, but the most chilling truth lies in their banality. Ordinary people, neighbors, priests, judges became agents of terror. No horns, no fangs, no magic, just suspicion sharpened into law and law wielded as a weapon. This ordinariness is what makes the story enduringly terrifying, for it whispers that such horrors could rise again under different names in any age. Some descendants of the accused now work to restore dignity to their ancestors. They petition governments for symbolic pardons. They hold memorials where names are read aloud. They place flowers at sites where executions once took place. These acts, though centuries late, stitch fragments of humanity back into history, giving voices once silenced a place to be heard again. Psychologists view the witch hunts as a case study in mass hysteria, a phenomenon where fear spreads like wildfire, overwhelming reason. Once a few accusations took hold, they infected entire towns until doubt itself became dangerous. To question the trials was to risk accusation, and so silence reigned. This psychological insight reminds us that the witch hunts were not merely relics of medieval thinking, they reveal patterns of human behavior that still echo today. The Church, centuries later, acknowledged its role in perpetuating the hunts. In some regions, bishops issued formal apologies admitting that faith had been twisted into a tool of cruelty. These apologies, though unable to undo the past, marked a turning point, an acknowledgement that silence and complicity are themselves forms of violence. Historians often end lectures on the witch hunts with a chilling reminder the victims were not extraordinary figures. They were bakers, midwives, widows, daughters. Their lives were ordinary, until suspicion branded them extraordinary in the worst way. In this ordinariness lies their legacy, for it proves that anyone can become a scapegoat when fear and power align. And so the tale of the tortured confessions is more than a story of the past. It is a mirror reflecting both the fragility of justice and the resilience of memory. The fires may have died, the instruments rusted, but the questions remain. What horrors are we ignoring now? Whose voices are we silencing with our fear? And will future generations look back at us as we look back at the witch hunts and wonder how we let it happen?